A company in Japan has reached an important milestone for the flying car, and our dreams of Jetson's future is that much closer. SkyDrive Incorporated's prototype flying car hovered for 4 minutes with a person on board, one of the few flying car concepts to reach that milestone. This puts the Toyota-backed startup ahead in the race for a future where we don't need roads, but don't say goodbye to ground transportation just yet. There's only 5 years between a pair of brothers taking flight, at Kitty Hawk and Henry Ford taking Carl Benn's creation, the automobile, and manufacturing it for the masses. That only took another 26 years for engineer Waldo Waterman to try and make flying and driving two great tastes that taste great together, with the first flying car, the Waterman Aerobile. Maybe it was a terrible name, or more likely that both car and airplane technology weren't ready to have their powers combined, but that hasn't stopped the dream of having a flying craft that sits in your garage and covers your commute like a regular car, but with no roads. Since the Aerobile in 1934, there have been a number of concepts that seek to fulfill our Jetson's dream of flying to work or play with limited success. Every so often, someone comes out with a clumsy car that sprouts wings and becomes a clumsy plane, but nothing like what issue after issue of popular mechanics promised for our future. Enter SkyDrive Inc. Rather than making a car that thinks it's a plane or a plane that thinks it's a car. SkyDrive has gone for the flying commuter vehicle version of the flying car, with an electrical, vertical takeoff and landing vehicle or eVTOL. There are over 100 companies, big and small, chasing the milestone that SkyDrive has reached with differing approaches. There are still those chasing Waterman's dream of a car you drive down the road and then press a button to deploy wings and take flight. A company called Terrafuga, formed in 2006, has had a vehicle in development that could make the transition from awkward road car to awkward airplane. The transition, that's the name. The transition you know because it transitions from a car to a plane is far enough along that it's accepting letters of intent to purchase, but not so far along that it's taking deposits. It also has in development the TF2, which is more in line with the SkyDrive SD-03, as a multirotor eVTOL craft. This year's Consumer Electronics show featured a flying car concept in partnership with Uber that it says will be ready by 2023 as a flying taxi. Other companies like the German company Lilium in Germany, Joby Aviation in California, and the joint venture between Boeing and Kitty Hawk Whisk are all developing their own eVTOL craft. Unlike most of those 100 or so other companies working on some kind of flying car, you really can sit in SkyDrive's SD-03 while it flies. It recently managed to hover for 4 minutes with a passenger on board, more than 86 years after Waterman's Aerobile. It seems like a strange high water mark for a flying car to meet, but that's just a reflection of how hard it is to create a vehicle of this kind. SkyDrive knows all too well how hard that can be. They experienced a far less successful test in 2017. SkyDrive Inc. started as a volunteer project called Cartivator. We've had almost 100 years and we still haven't managed to come up with a good name for a flying car that was funded by companies like Toyota, Panasonic, and Bandai Namco. Yes, that Bandai Namco, the people who brought you Pac-Man, are now paying the bills on bringing you a flying car. While things didn't go as well as intended in 2017, they did go well enough for finances like the Development Bank of Japan to infuse the company with another $37 million, which brought the company to this milestone. That few flying cars have reached having crossed this threshold. SkyDrive hopes to have its own flying taxi by 2023. Does that date sound familiar with the same one that Hyundai and Uber are aiming for as well? There's a reason. Japan is bullish on flying cars, not just in the general enthusiasm kind of way, but in the major investments and council that will help put government agency researchers and companies all on the same page. That's an important step because there are a lot of steps between the test pilot doing careful maneuvers in a controlled environment and hailing an air taxi to the Tokyo Skytree. First of all, if you're worried about bad drivers becoming bad flyers, so is everyone. That has meant that the prevailing wisdom is to have the aircraft fly themselves. No small feat when the best we've managed to do with commercially available cars is have your Tesla find you in a parking lot. Eventually, the advantage, of course, is presumably in the sky. There will only be these flying taxis, but they'll still have to communicate with each other and the ground to coordinate paths and trajectories. As part of Japan's initiative, there is a man named Nobio Kishi, whose job it is to think of all the ways a flying car can go wrong. What do you do if one of the routers goes out? Or more than one? How do you get the craft safely to the ground without it landing on someone? He and researchers like him have to figure out how to coordinate all that flying with all that living underneath all the flying cars. Sanjeev Singh is a Carnegie Mellon professor and leads a company called Near Earth Autonomy, who develops naturally autonomous flight software. Singh started off trying to make cars drive themselves and feels like flying cars have the advantage of everything being an obstacle the car should stay away from, saying you don't have to figure out if that's a tumbleweed or a suitcase on the street. There are other problems. Currently, a rotor-based craft is the simpler and cheaper version of the concept, but they run out of power quickly. So far, with ranges of just 5 km as the crow flies in cities, that's a healthy distance. But in places like Australia, that is also banking on flying cars' distance and speed are more important. That means craft that can lift off vertically and then fly more conventionally, faster and longer, but more expensive and with enthusiasm for the flying car, at least within development circles, at an all-time high expensive isn't the barrier. It normally would be all told. SkyDrive has raised almost $60 million to develop its tiny multicopter flying car. But outside of our Jetsons fantasies and all the promises made by people like Waterman in 1934, and science fiction writers ever since are flying cars even going to be worth? And even though the drivers on the streets and fly like a plane style driving car is still being developed by companies like Terrafugia and Aeromobile, that future doesn't seem impossible, just not as desirable. Regular air flight is complex and a whole other set of licenses, and while you technically could just use an open bit of highway as a runway, you almost certainly would never be allowed to. So at best, it's kind of a compromised car. You drive to an airport where you turn it into kind of a compromised airplane to fly to another airport. The specificity of that kind of use means that the market would have to be limited to people who both have a driver's license and a pilot license, who would like to commute to and from a place with easy access to an airport. Waterman's dream may never be a common commercial reality. Battery technology and multi-rotor craft and other available technologies have opened the door for vehicles like SkyDrive SD-03, and unlike the half-car, half-plane flying car, these low-altitude craft can change the landscape. Not only is Japan's goal to make it easy to get from one side of crowded Tokyo to the other in 10 minutes, they also hope to connect more remote areas with areas that would include both transportation and emergency services. Imagine an ambulance that doesn't have to wait its way through traffic. Software and technology are only part of the equation. The flying car also has to navigate the regulation of airspace at about 150 meters, the altitude border between commercial drone flights and helicopters. Another consideration is that multi-router flying cars are extraordinarily loud, like 100 murder hornets trying to hum the 1812 overture by beating their wings. SkyDrive hopes that working on the aerodynamics of the blades will address that. All the unforeseen hurdles that drones-based air taxis face on a larger scale, including safety, privacy, and concepts like who owns the air above a property, and how much of it, with all those considerations, it seems overly optimistic that we'll be able to hail a sky taxi in Tokyo from SkyDrive or Hyundai and Uber in only 3 years. William Corsley, a Purdue University researcher into aerospace technology, told CNN, "If things go exactly right, we might be able to expect the flying car in 10 years. Well, that can either feel daunting or like chasing a dollar down the street that someone is attached to a fishing line. The advantages are hard to ignore for the lucky companies that unlock the secret to flying cars. The rewards could be astronomical." Morgan Stanley research figures that the eVTOL market, including flying cars, cargo, and emergency services, will be a $1.6 trillion, that's trillion with T, industry. That's gold rush money. And SkyDrive has taken that first lead with their successful test. Now, if we could only solve the names of these vehicle cars and aircraft, have cool names like Cobra and Raptor, we can do better than Cartivator. Are you ready for the flying taxi future? What would you name your flying car? Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, be sure to subscribe to The Richest, and we'll fly the latest videos into your inbox.